All right, so we're going to be diving deep today into the legal side of being a creator. We're taking a look at Mitch Jackson's book, Legal Tips for Creators. It's basically like a guidebook for navigating copyright contracts, even that crazy world of AI and the metaverse.
Yeah, it's interesting how Jackson cuts through all the legal jargon. He gives creators really solid advice.
Yeah.
And he really emphasizes that even if you're, not running a big studio, you still got to think like a business.
Right. It's like, wait, I'm an artist, I'm a writer, like I'm not a lawyer. But Jackson really lays out why this stuff matters. He uses this great analogy. Imagine like a client sues you over a project gone wrong. Without a legal entity like an LLC, your personal assets could be on the line. Your house, your car, like...
Exactly. It's like you're separating, your passion
Right.
from your personal liability.
Right. An LLC is like a field.
Yeah.
And speaking of things we might overlook, all those times we just click agree on those terms of service agreements.
Oh yeah, the dreaded TOS. Jackson, he points out how important it is to actually read those things. I know it's painful, but it can save you so much trouble down the road. Buried in all that text are clauses that determine who owns your work, how it can be used, even by AI, and where legal disputes will be settled.
So it's not just about some company tracking my data. It's about the actual ownership of my work.
Absolutely. And with AI becoming more and more prevalent, in creative fields, this is more important than ever. I mean, imagine pouring your heart into a piece of digital art, only to find out that the platform you uploaded it to can now use it to train their AI without your consent, or even claim ownership.
That's a scary thought. It makes you realize how important copyright is.
Yeah.
I always thought it was just about putting that little copyright symbol on my work.
It's more than just a symbol.
Yeah.
Jackson compares registering your copyright to adding a deadbolt to your front door. It's not just about claiming ownership. It's about having that legal backing if someone tries to steal your work.
So if someone tries to pass off my music as theirs or use my characters without permission, I have a better chance of fighting back if my copyright is registered.
Exactly. It's like having that solid evidence that you are the rightful owner. And it's not just about protecting yourself from theft. It's also important when someone wants to use your work legitimately.
You mean even if they ask permission?
Even then, a simple thanks isn't enough. You need a clear licensing agreement. That spells out how they can use your work, for how long, and in what context.
Okay, that's making a lot more sense now. It's like having a set of rules for how your work can be shared.
Right. And speaking of protection, we can't forget about trademarks, especially if you're building a brand. Your band name, your logo, that catchy tagline you came up with, those are assets that need legal protection.
Trademarks are like a shield around your brand.
Exactly. Jackson stresses that securing a trademark early on is so crucial to avoid those "I built this brand, but someone else owns the name" situations.
Oh, yeah. Not only would that be heartbreaking, but also it would probably lead to some really expensive legal battles.
Exactly.
Okay, so trademarking your brand is like a proactive step to prevent headaches down the line.
It is. And it's not just about the big names. Even if you're a small creator, building a recognizable brand is so important to stand out. And trademarks are a part of that. Now let's talk about something that can be a bit tricky. Fair use versus licensing.
Okay. I've always been a little fuzzy on those terms.
Fair use is often misunderstood. Jackson makes it clear that just because you credit the source, it doesn't mean you're legally in the clear.
So adding a caption saying photo by so-and-so, that's not a free pass to use whatever you want.
Nope. It's about understanding the nuances of fair use and knowing when you actually need a license. Those 4 factors the courts consider: purpose, nature, amount, and market impact. It can be tricky to navigate.
Could you give an example of when you might need a license versus when fair use might apply?
Sure. Let's say you're a blogger and you want to use a single image from a photographer's website in your latest post. Even that could land you in hot water if it's not considered fair use. On the other hand, if you're creating a music mashup or using a significant portion of someone else's work in your own, you'll almost certainly need a license.
So there's a lot of gray area.
There is. And that's why Jackson emphasizes the importance of doing your research, understanding the law, and when in doubt, erring on the side of caution. Now let's move on to another biggie. Contracts. I know, not the most exciting topic, but hear me out.
Contracts always seem a bit intimidating, especially when you're working with friends or collaborators. It feels like you're saying, I don't trust you.
I get it. But as Jackson points out, a solid contract isn't about mistrust. It's about setting clear expectations and protecting everyone involved.
It's like having everything in writing so there are no surprises.
Precisely. And he gives some great advice on what to include, like outlining each person's roles and responsibilities. defining payment terms, and even addressing how disputes will be resolved.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like creating a roadmap for your collaboration.
Exactly. And one thing he emphasizes is the difference between work for hire and independent contractor agreements. If you're hiring someone, you need to be clear on who owns the final product.
So if I hire a designer to create a logo for my brand, do I automatically own the copyright?
Well, that depends on the agreement you have. If it's a work for hire agreement, then yes, you would typically own the copyright. But if they're working as an independent contractor, they may retain the copyright, unless you have a specific clause in the contract transferring ownership to you.
Okay, see, this is where things get really tricky. And with AI playing a bigger role in creative fields, I imagine these conversations are getting even more complex.
They are, and Jackson highlights the need to address AI and intellectual property rights in contracts, making sure it's clear who owns what when an algorithm is involved.
It's a whole other layer of complexity. I hadn't even considered that. It's eye-opening to think about how, like, even just talking about your work can potentially lead to legal issues.
It can. And Jackson, he doesn't shy away from those real-life scenarios. He talks about the minefield of defamation, especially if you're drawing inspiration from real-life events.
So even if I'm telling the truth, there's still a chance I could get into legal trouble.
Yes, especially if the way you present that truth could harm someone's reputation. Context and careful phrasing are crucial, especially if you're writing a memoir, creating a documentary, or anything that touches on real people and events.
That's a good reminder. I'm starting to see how easy it is to make mistakes, even unintentionally. Speaking of potentially tricky areas, what about publicity rights?
That's another big one if you're thinking of using someone's likeness. Their image, their voice, their name, you need to know the rules. And it's not as simple as just getting their permission.
So even if my friend says, sure, use my photo on your website, there's more to it than that.
Yes. There are laws and regulations to consider. Using someone's likeness for commercial purposes can get you into legal hot water if you don't have the proper permissions and releases.
Wow. It seems like every step of the creative process has potential legal pitfalls.
It's not about being paranoid or letting fear stifle your creativity. It's about being informed, knowing your rights, and taking steps to protect yourself and your work.
That makes sense. I'd rather learn the rules of the game up front than have to deal with a legal headache later on.
Exactly. And speaking of rules, let's talk about something that can be a bit dry, but is essential for any creator who wants to make a living: royalties and revenue agreements.
I'll admit, this isn't the most glamorous part of being a creator. Talking about money can feel awkward.
It can, but Jackson makes it clear that being upfront about financial matters is essential for healthy working relationships.
It's like setting ground rules for financial fairness.
Exactly. He emphasizes defining terms like royalties and revenue sharing, which can be interpreted in different ways and lead to confusion and conflict.
So it's not just about splitting the money evenly. It's about agreeing on how that split is calculated.
Absolutely. And he talks about transparency in financial reporting, making sure everyone has access to a clear breakdown of revenue and expenses.
Right. No shady business.
No?
What about audit rights? I've heard that term, but I'm not really sure what it means.
Audit rights basically give you the power to review financial records, to ensure everything is above board. This can be important for preventing disputes and making sure everyone is getting their fair share.
It's like a safety net.
Exactly. And Jackson also cautions creators about promising financial returns to backers, particularly with crowdfunding.
Yeah, crowdfunding has become so popular, but I can see how it could get legally tricky.
It can. Venturing into securities territory is something you want to avoid.
So it's best to focus on the creative aspects and let legal and financial experts handle those complex areas.
That's a great approach. Now, before we move on, let's talk about something that's often overlooked, but incredibly important: securing your creative legacy.
I'll admit I haven't given that much thought. It feels a bit morbid to think about what happens to my work after I'm gone.
I get it, but it's about being responsible and ensuring that your hard work lives on.
So what are some steps creators can take?
Jackson suggests having a will or trust in place, designating a successor, and keeping detailed records of your work.
So it's not just about protecting our work while we're alive, it's about ensuring it continues to be valued.
Exactly. And in today's digital world, this conversation about owning your work and securing your legacy, it takes on a whole new dimension.
It does. It's like the Wild West out there,
Is
with platforms and algorithms having so much say.
It's a reminder that those terms of service agreements we often ignore can have a huge impact.
Right. It's like we're handing over the keys to our kingdom without even realizing it.
It's about being informed, being proactive, and taking steps to maintain control.
And speaking of control, data privacy and security are huge concerns these days. We often collect information from our audience, email addresses, payment details, feedback.
Protecting that information is paramount, not just legally, but ethically. It's about respecting your audience's trust.
Yeah. Failing to do so could really damage your reputation
Absolutely.
and lead to legal problems.
It's not just about protecting yourself. It's about being a responsible member of the creative community.
It's about setting a good example.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Or I guess I should say the algorithm in the room. AI. This is an area that's still evolving, and it raises some big questions about ownership and control.
AI is being used in so many creative fields already. Music, art writing, even video game design. It's exciting. But it's also a little unsettling, especially when it comes to who owns what.
Right. Jackson reminds us that copyright laws as they stand now favor humans, not machines.
So if an AI creates something entirely on its own, without any human input, can it be copyrighted?
Generally, no. But what happens when human input is involved? What if you're working with an AI tool as a creative partner, providing prompts, making edits, guiding the process?
That's where things get a little murky.
Exactly. If your creative direction or edits played a role in the final output, you might have a claim to ownership. But this is an area that's still being debated.
It's like we're writing the legal playbook as we go.
In a way, we are. That's why Jackson emphasizes the importance of being proactive when working with AI. Define ownership rights clearly in your contracts and keep detailed records of your creative contributions.
So even in this world of AI-assisted creativity, good old-fashioned documentation is still key.
It is. And speaking of new frontiers, let's talk about the metaverse. It's a rapidly evolving space, full of creative potential, but it also comes with its own legal and ethical considerations.
The metaverse is still kind of a mystery to me, like a whole other digital universe.
It can feel that way, and one of the things Jackson highlights is the importance of clear contracts that address ownership in virtual spaces. Who owns the virtual real estate, the designs, the avatars, the content? These are all questions that need to be addressed up front.
I can imagine spending months building a virtual world, only to find out the platform I'm using claims ownership.
That would be a nightmare. That's why understanding those terms of service agreements is crucial. And if you're working with collaborators in the metaverse, make sure you have solid contracts that protect your rights.
So even though it feels like a separate reality, real-world legal principles still apply.
They do. And don't forget about intellectual property rights. With the ease of copying and distributing digital content, protecting your work is paramount.
So we're talking about digital watermarks again, and maybe even using blockchain technology.
Those are definitely tools you can use. Jackson also suggests registering copyrights and exploring new technologies that protect digital assets.
It's like we need a whole new legal toolkit.
We do. And maybe the most important tool is staying informed. The metaverse is constantly evolving, and the legal landscape is still developing.
Flexibility is key.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this part of our conversation, I want to go back to something that Jackson emphasizes, the power of community.
I love that he talks about this. It's so easy to feel isolated as a creator, but there's real strength in connecting with others who understand what we go through.
Couldn't agree more. Jackson encourages creators to find their tribe. Connect with other artists, writers, musicians, metaverse builders, anyone who shares that passion.
It's like a creative guild.
Exactly. By sharing knowledge, supporting each other, and advocating for our rights together, we can create a more equitable and sustainable creative landscape.
That's inspiring. What else does Jackson have for us on this legal adventure?
Let's dive into some more of those legal concepts and practical strategies for protecting your creative work in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
Picking up where we left off, I want to explore something that's super important to creators. Moral rights.
Yeah, this is something I've always felt strongly about. It's not just about the legal stuff, It's about protecting the heart of your work.
Exactly. Jackson talks about that emotional connection creators have with their work. He says it's not just about someone like stealing your song or copying your painting. It's about making sure your work isn't misused or distorted in a way that violates your vision.
Right. It's like someone taking your beautiful painting and slapping on a bunch of crazy filters to use in an ad for something totally random.
Yeah, it's like your heart breaks a little. Copyright might not cover that, but moral rights can.
That's interesting. It's interesting how these rights differ around the world. Jackson mentions that Europe has stronger protections for moral rights than the U.S.
That's a really important point for creators whose work is shared internationally. You might have more power to protect your vision in some countries than others.
It's like you need a global legal strategy.
Right. And speaking of strategy, there's one area a lot of creators don't think about. Taxes and financial planning.
Ugh, taxes. Not my favorite topic.
I know. But Jackson's right when he says that treating your passion like a business means taking care of the money side, too.
Right, so we can't just make art and hope for the best.
Unfortunately not. He says creators should separate their personal and business finances, understand self-employment taxes, and keep really good records.
Okay, so a good system is key.
Yeah. He even recommends hiring a tax professional who specializes in creative businesses.
Someone who gets it.
Exactly. Someone who speaks your language.
I guess investing in that kind of advice early on can save you trouble later.
Definitely. And it frees you up to focus on creating. Now let's talk about something that's become really popular for funding projects, crowdfunding, and pre-sales.
Yeah, those platforms have been amazing for independent creators. But I bet there are some legal things to keep in mind.
There are. Jackson really stresses being clear about what you promise backers. Realistic timelines, transparent communication about risks. It's all about trust. And avoiding legal issues.
I could see how things could go wrong if a creator overpromises and then can't deliver.
Right. And he's really cautious about promising financial returns to backers. That can get into tricky territory with securities regulations.
So keep the focus on the project itself.
Exactly. And while we're talking about navigating tricky stuff, let's talk about partnerships and collaborations. They can be amazing, but they can also have some downsides.
It's like any relationship. Communication is key.
Absolutely. Jackson says you gotta have clear agreements that spell out who owns what, how decisions are made, and how profits are shared.
So even with your best friend, have those tough conversations.
It might be awkward, but it's better than dealing with resentment later.
Right. It's like a prenup for your creative partnership.
Exactly. He even suggests having an exit strategy, just in case things don't work out.
That makes sense. To protect everyone.
Yes. And here's something people don't talk about enough. Get insurance.
Insurance. I thought that was just for big companies.
Not at all. Even small creative businesses face risks. Copyright claims, liability issues, even something unexpected happening.
It's like a safety net.
Exactly. Jackson says to look into things like professional liability insurance, intellectual property insurance, even general liability insurance.
Ease of mind is worth it.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the online world. Social media, marketplaces, platforms. That's where so much creativity happens these days.
Right, but it can feel a bit like the Wild West.
It can. And Jackson, again, he says those terms of service agreements are important.
Those long things nobody reads.
Yeah, those. But they can have a huge impact on your rights. They determine who owns your work, how it can be used, how you get paid.
So we have to pay attention to the fine print.
You do.
Yeah.
And what about those risks? Like getting your account suspended or having your work stolen.
Yeah, that's scary.
Jackson says just because you post something online doesn't mean you give up your copyright.
Right, but how do you enforce that?
That's the tough part. Jackson says be proactive. Use watermarks, register your copyright, even explore blockchain technology.
It's like you're gearing up for battle.
It is. And just as important as protecting your work is protecting your audience's data.
Data privacy is a big deal these days.
It is. Jackson says to have clear privacy policies, secure your websites, and be transparent with your audience.
It's about trust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, are you ready for something a little mind-bending?
Bring it on. I think I'm getting the hang of this legal stuff.
Okay, good. Let's talk about AI. It's changing everything. But it also brings up these questions about ownership.
Yeah, it's moving so fast.
It is. Jackson does a good job explaining it all. He says copyright laws right now assume the creator is human.
So if AI makes something completely on its own,
Yeah.
is that copyrightable?
Right now, no. But what if a human is involved? Like working with the AI as a partner, giving it prompts, making edits.
Things get fuzzy there.
They do. If your input was a big part of the final product, you might be able to claim ownership. But it's still being figured out.
It's like we're in uncharted waters.
We are. That's why Jackson says to be proactive. Define ownership clearly in contracts and keep track of what you contribute.
So even with AI, documentation matters.
It does. Okay, now let's talk about the metaverse, another new frontier. Lots of potential, but also legal stuff to think about.
The metaverse is still a bit of a mystery to me.
It is for a lot of people. Jackson talks about clear contracts in virtual spaces, who owns the virtual land, the designs, the avatars. All that needs to be clear from the start.
Right. Imagine building a whole virtual world and then finding out you don't own it.
Exactly. Understand those terms of service agreements, and if you're working with others, have good contracts.
So real-world laws still matter in the metaverse.
They do. And what about intellectual property? Protecting your work is so important.
Back to those watermarks.
Yeah, and copyright registration, and even new technologies specifically for digital assets.
It's a whole new set of tools.
It is, and staying informed is crucial. Things change fast.
Flexibility.
Yes. Before we finish this part, I want to mention something Jackson talks about a lot. Community.
I love that. It's easy to feel alone as a creator.
It is.
But connecting with others is so important.
It is. Find your people. Other artists, writers, musicians, metaverse builders, people who get it.
It's like a guild.
Exactly. By sharing knowledge and supporting each other, we can make things better for everyone.
That's a great message. Okay, so what's next on our legal journey? Okay, my brain is full of all this legal stuff, but before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious about one thing. Resale royalties. That seems like a really big deal for creators, especially in the digital world.
It is a big deal. It's like, imagine you sell a piece of digital art early in your career. Maybe it doesn't go for much at the time, but as you become more successful, the value of that art goes up. With a normal sale, you don't see any of that extra money.
Right. It's like someone else is profiting from your success.
Exactly. But with resale royalties, you get a percentage every time the artwork is resold, even years later.
So you're rewarded for the long-term value of your work.
Exactly. And the cool thing is how technology is making this happen. Jackson talks about NFTs and blockchain technology. They let creators embed those royalties right into the smart contracts.
It was automatic.
Exactly. It's a huge change, especially for digital artists.
Yeah.
Their early work can become super valuable. And even for physical art, Jackson says you can include clauses in your contracts to address those resales.
So it's about creators having control and getting what they deserve. Now, speaking of the long term, we haven't really talked about protecting our creative legacy. Not the most fun thing to think about, but it's important, right?
It is, and Jackson talks about it. He says creators need to think about what happens to their work if they can't manage it anymore or if they pass away.
It's about making sure your vision lives on and that your work doesn't become a problem for your family.
Exactly. Practical things like having a will or a trust, choosing someone to take over, keeping good records. All of that's crucial.
There's like a plan for your creative legacy.
Exactly. And in this digital world, it's even more complicated. Jackson talks about AI, intellectual property in the metaverse, even things like public performance rights online. It's a lot.
It feels like we're just starting to understand it all.
We are, but one of the big takeaways from Jackson's book is this. See yourself as an entrepreneur, not just a creator.
It's about owning your creative business, knowing your rights, and seeing that your creativity has real value.
Exactly. It's not about letting the legal stuff hold you back. It's about using it to your advantage so you can keep creating.
So, to sum it all up, what's the most important thing for creators to remember?
Knowledge is power. The more you know about the legal and business side of things, the more control you have over your work, your career, your future. Don't be afraid to ask for help and stand up for yourself.
It's like Jackson says in his book, you've got the talent, the ambition, and now hopefully a little legal savvy too. Go out there and create knowing you have the tools to protect your amazing work.